In the spring of 1844, Savannah's most admired family stood on the edge of social immortality. Their daughters were envied, their name whispered with reverence in drawing rooms from Charleston to New Orleans. But behind shuttered windows and magnolia shadows, something impossible was unfolding, something that would collapse an empire of reputation in a single night. 6 sisters, 1 enslaved man, and a secret so perfectly hidden that even the women themselves did not realize they were sharing it until it was too late. In the spring of 1844, Savannah presented itself as a city perfected by restraint, where elegance functioned as both armor and currency, and nowhere was that illusion more carefully maintained than within the Hartwell household, a mansion whose pale facade and iron-laced balconies had become a symbol of inherited certainty. The house sat slightly elevated above the street, not by accident but by design, its position allowing those inside to look down, politely, discreetly, on the world beyond its gates. To Savannah society, the Hartwells were not merely wealthy, they were correct. Their name appeared on shipping manifests, charity rolls, church donations, and political correspondence, always spelled cleanly, always unblemished by rumor. Inside that house lived 6 daughters, each raised with almost scientific precision, each shaped to embody the family's future alliances. From childhood, they were taught that beauty was not enough. It had to be controlled, curated, protected from exposure. Their days followed a rigid rhythm of lessons, embroidery, music, scripture, and supervised walks through the garden paths where magnolia petals fell like decoration rather than nature. Every movement was observed, every conversation filtered, every smile measured for appropriateness. Their father believed surveillance was love and discipline was protection. He believed that by controlling every variable, he could guarantee outcomes. He was wrong, though the realization would arrive too late to save anything. What no one beyond the Hartwell walls ever understood was how quiet the house truly was, how silence settled into corners and lingered between breaths, how loneliness could grow even where privilege was abundant. The sisters were rarely alone, yet they were profoundly isolated from themselves. They knew what was expected of them long before they knew who they were allowed to be. Savannah admired them not as individuals, but as a matched set, jewels to be displayed at the proper moment and exchanged for influence through marriage. Their father spoke often of futures, but never of desire. Desire was something he believed could be trained out of them through proximity and supervision. He trusted the walls, the servants, the rules. He trusted the system, and that trust extended downward toward the enslaved people who moved silently through the house, whose presence was so constant it faded into the architecture itself. Among them was a man named Elias, though that name existed only in plantation ledgers and spoken commands. He was assigned tasks that required discretion, carrying messages, tending the garden paths near the house, repairing shutters, assisting with deliveries that crossed between public and private spaces. He was educated enough to understand the rhythms of those above him, and disciplined enough not to disrupt them. To the Hartwells, that made him useful. To Savannah society, it made him invisible. No one questioned his presence near the balconies or along the side paths because no one questioned the assumption that he was incapable of threat. That assumption was the second mistake. Elias observed the house not with longing but with clarity. He saw the way the sisters lingered at windows longer than necessary, how their laughter softened when they believed no one important was listening, how each of them carried a version of the same hunger shaped by different silences. He did not approach them all at once. He waited. He understood timing better than anyone who believed themselves in control. The first moment was small, almost forgettable, an exchange of glances beneath the magnolia tree when one sister paused during her evening walk, her chaperone momentarily distracted. Elias lowered his eyes as expected, but not before allowing just enough acknowledgement to register. That acknowledgement stayed with her long after she returned inside. It felt accidental, it felt safe, and safety, in a house ruled by rules, was intoxicating. Before we go any further, if stories like this, stories that expose how fragile power really is, draw you in, subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss what unfolds next, and leave a comment telling me what you're feeling as this story begins, because what happened inside this house was never meant to be remembered, only whispered away. The Hartwell daughters did not speak openly of their loneliness. They had been trained not to. But loneliness has a way of leaking through restraint, and Elias learned how to listen without appearing to hear. A word here, a glance there, moments stretched just long enough to suggest possibility without demanding consequence. He never rushed. He never repeated himself. Each interaction was shaped to feel singular, unrepeatable, as though fate itself had briefly bent around that one connection. To the first sister, he was a secret discovered by chance. To the second, he was a confidant encountered by design. To the third, a shadow that felt like choice. None of them knew they were not unique in this discovery, because Elias never behaved the same way twice. He adjusted tone, distance, silence. He understood that the house had trained them to recognize patterns, and so he avoided patterns entirely. What made this possible was not audacity, but the arrogance of those in power. The Hartwell father believed he knew every corner of his house, every movement within it. He believed the enslaved people under his control were incapable of interior lives complex enough to threaten him. He believed his daughter's virtue could be preserved through proximity and punishment rather than trust. And because he believed these things absolutely, he stopped looking. The magnolia trees grew unchecked along the side of the house, their branches thick enough to support quiet weight. The balconies remained unguarded at night, because no one imagined anyone would dare approach them. The servants' routes through the house were so familiar they ceased to be noticed. Elias did not break rules. He moved through the spaces the rules ignored, and the sisters, raised to obey, never questioned why something that felt forbidden also felt so entirely their own. What began as curiosity soon deepened into secrecy, and secrecy became identity. Each sister carried her hidden connection like a private rebellion, a proof that she was more than what had been planned for her. They did not imagine consequences beyond discovery, and even that seemed distant, theoretical. After all, the house had never failed them before. Savannah had never failed the Hartwells. History, they believed, moved in straight lines for families like theirs. They did not know they were standing at the edge of a fracture, one that had already formed beneath their feet, widening silently, patiently, waiting for the moment when everything they trusted would fall into it at once. What none of the sisters understood at the time, what they could not understand because no one had ever taught them how, was that Elias's greatest advantage was not daring or deception, but perception sharpened by necessity. From childhood he had learned to read rooms the way others read scripture, to notice pauses in conversation, shifts in posture, glances that lingered a fraction too long before discipline forced them away. Survival had trained him to interpret the unspoken, and in the Hartwell house the unspoken was everywhere. The sisters had been educated to perform refinement, but not to recognize their own emotional starvation. They were surrounded by people constantly, yet starved of intimacy that did not come with expectation. Elias did not approach them as a conqueror or provocateur. He approached them as someone who saw them, not as daughters to be traded, not as symbols of a family's future, but as individuals quietly suffocating inside identical roles. That recognition was intoxicating precisely because it had never been offered before. He spoke carefully, never too much, never too directly. A comment about the evening air, an observation about a book left unfinished, a question framed as curiosity rather than challenge. Each exchange was calibrated to suggest depth without demanding vulnerability. To the second sister, their connection felt deliberate, almost fated, as though she had chosen it rather than stumbled into it. She noticed him first not in the garden, but in the hallway outside the music room, where he paused just long enough to comment on a melody she had been practicing, something no one else ever did without criticism. The remark stayed with her, echoing in the silence of her room that night. When she saw him again days later, she believed the moment had been created just for her. not realizing that Elias had learned the household's rhythms so well that he could predict where each sister would be, and when, without drawing suspicion. To the third sister, Elias appeared as a quiet confidant during a period of private grief no one had noticed. She had lost a childhood friend to illness, and the house had moved on too quickly, as it always did. Listened when she spoke of it in half-formed sentences, offering no solutions, no reassurances, only presence. That presence became a mirror in which she could finally see herself reflected without judgment. She told herself this was different, deeper, that no one else could possibly understand him the way she did. Elias never corrected that assumption. He never confirmed it either. He let belief do the work for him. What made the situation increasingly dangerous was how carefully separated each relationship remained, not just physically, but emotionally. Elias never reused phrases. He never repeated gestures. Each sister experienced a version of him tailored so precisely to her inner life that overlap felt impossible. The fourth sister encountered him through written words, brief notes slipped between pages of books he knew she would borrow from the family library, comments about passages she underlined, questions posed without signature. The anonymity created intimacy without exposure, allowing her to project intelligence, sensitivity, even romantic intent onto a figure who remained just out of reach. When she finally confronted him about the notes, the relief she felt at discovering he was real anchored the connection more firmly than any physical encounter could have. The fifth sister's attachment grew from defiance. She had always been the most restless, the most resistant to her father's rules, and Elias became the embodiment of rebellion she could not articulate aloud. Their meetings were brief, charged, conducted in places chosen for their risk rather than their comfort. To her, danger was proof of authenticity. She believed Elias met her there because he trusted her more than the others she did not know existed. And the sixth sister, the youngest, the most closely watched, fell not through action but imagination. She observed the subtle changes in her sisters, moods lifted without explanation, absences justified too easily, and began to suspect there was something she had not yet discovered. Elias noticed her watching before she noticed him. When he finally allowed her to see him looking back, it felt like initiation rather than seduction. She believed she had uncovered a secret hidden from everyone else. Elias allowed her to believe it, knowing that belief would bind her more tightly than truth, for could. Through all of this, the Hartwell household remained oblivious, not because signs were absent, but because acknowledging them would have required questioning assumptions too foundational to disturb. The father trusted the architecture of his authority, the walls, the servants, the schedules, the social rules that had protected generations before him. He mistook repetition for permanence. He did not consider that systems designed to control visibility often create blindness instead. Elias moved through these blind spots with increasing confidence, not out of arrogance, but because each successful encounter reinforced the same lesson: no one was looking for him. The sisters, meanwhile, began to change in ways subtle enough to be dismissed as maturation. They smiled differently. They argued less. They endured the suffocating rituals of society with an inward patience that looked like obedience. Each carried a private certainty that whatever their future held, arranged marriage, relocation, obedience, they possessed something that belonged only to them, something untouched by their father's plans. That certainty made them careless in ways they could not recognize. They lingered too long at windows. They excused themselves more often. They trusted that secrecy itself was protection, unaware that secrecy without knowledge is merely delay. The tragedy was not that six sisters fell for the same man. The tragedy was that each believed isolation made her safe, never realizing that isolation was precisely what made the truth inevitable. And as spring deepened into summer, and the Hartwell house prepared for the grand debutante ball that would seal the sisters' futures in public view, all seven of them, Elias and the six sisters, continued forward, convinced in different ways that they were in control of what they had created, unaware that the structure surrounding them was already straining under the weight of too many hidden truths, all moving toward the same night, the same staircase, the same moment when separation would collapse into revelation. By the time summer settled fully over Savannah, heavy and perfumed with magnolia and river damp, the secret that bound the 6 sisters to Elias had evolved beyond thrill into structure, a carefully balanced architecture of anticipation and restraint that none of them consciously designed, yet all of them relied upon. Each believed her connection existed in a sealed chamber of reality, insulated from intrusion by the sheer improbability of its exposure. The house itself seemed to conspire in that belief. Doors closed softly, hallways absorbed footsteps, night air thickened sound until whispers dissolved into nothing before they could travel. Elias understood the importance of this environment and used it not as cover, but as collaborator. He timed his movements with the precision of someone who had learned that error carried consequences far beyond embarrassment. He never approached the same balcony twice in succession, never lingered long enough to create expectation, never allowed routine to calcify into habit. Each meeting was framed as rare, precarious, dependent on trust rather than opportunity. That framing was essential. It made each sister feel chosen, not shared. And because they were raised to compete silently for approval, of their father, of society, of an unseen future, they interpreted that sense of being chosen as proof of singular worth. What none of them recognized was that the very training meant to preserve their virtue had prepared them perfectly for deception. They were accustomed to living double lives already, public composure and private yearning, obedient speech and censored thought. Elias did not introduce duplicity into their world, he simply gave it a focal point. As weeks passed, the sisters' internal narratives grew increasingly elaborate. They imagined futures not necessarily involving Elias openly. None were foolish enough to believe such a future could exist, but futures shaped by what he represented. For one sister, he became a standard by which all future husbands would fail. For another, he was proof that intimacy could exist without ownership. For another still, he embodied the idea that choice itself was possible, even if fleeting. Elias did not encourage these projections, he allowed them to flourish unchallenged. He understood that fantasy is strongest when left uninterrupted. His own interior life during this period was far less romantic than the sisters would have imagined. He was not in love with 6 women. He was not constructing a grand act of rebellion. What drove him was something colder and more precise, the awareness that the Hartwell house, for all its surveillance, was hollow at its core. It relied on assumptions rather than observation, hierarchy rather than understanding. Elias had learned long ago that systems built on dehumanization inevitably misunderstand humanity, and that misunderstanding creates openings. Each successful meeting confirmed what he already knew. He was not being watched because no one believed he needed to be. That belief emboldened him, but it also sharpened his caution. He knew this arrangement could not last indefinitely. All secrets collapse eventually. The only variable was timing. The sisters, meanwhile, began to experience the first tremors of that collapse without recognizing them as such. Jealousy surfaced in unfamiliar forms, an inexplicable irritation when another sister smiled too easily, a sharp curiosity about movements that did not align with known routines. These feelings were quickly suppressed, interpreted as fatigue or mood. The sisters had been taught that emotional disturbance was a failure of discipline, not a signal of truth. They did not compare notes. They did not confide in one another. Their bond as sisters, carefully maintained in public, had never included true vulnerability. Each had learned early that privacy was safer than honesty, especially within a family where everything was measured and reported. Elias benefited from this fragmentation. The more isolated each sister remained within her own version of the secret, the less likely they were to see the shape of the whole. He never spoke of exclusivity, but he allowed exclusivity to be assumed. He never promised permanence, but he allowed permanence to be imagined. That distinction mattered. It meant that when doubts arose, they were internalized rather than addressed. A sister who wondered whether Elias had been absent too long blamed herself for expecting too much. Another who noticed a scratch on his hand, unexplained, dismissed the thought that it might have come from elsewhere. The human mind is remarkably skilled at protecting the stories it needs to survive. Savannah society outside the Hartwell walls continued its rituals, oblivious. Invitations were sent, dressmakers consulted, the debutante ball approached like an inevitable tide, bringing with it the unspoken understanding that whatever freedom the sisters felt was temporary. This knowledge intensified everything. Meetings grew more urgent, not in frequency but in emotional weight. Each encounter carried the silent pressure of finality. Elias felt this shift acutely. He recognized the danger of escalation, the way urgency can erode discretion. He began shortening visits, increasing intervals, introducing absence as a stabilizing force. This restraint, intended to preserve control, had the opposite effect on the sisters. Absence amplified attachment. Silence deepened longing. Each believed the distance was circumstantial, imposed by risk rather than choice. None imagined that the risk was already larger than they understood. The magnolia trees, once symbols of secrecy, became witnesses to accumulating tension. Branches bent under repeated climbs, bark scarred where hands gripped too tightly. The physical world was recording what human memory refused to reconcile. Even the house itself seemed to respo. Floorboards creaked at the wrong moments. Doors resisted closing. The illusion of perfect containment began to fray at the edges. Still, no one spoke. The father remained confident, focused on guest lists and alliances, convinced that the ball would confirm everything he believed about his family and his control over it. Elias watched preparations with a growing sense of inevitability. He knew the convergence point was approaching. 6 separate secrets cannot occupy the same space forever without colliding. He told himself he would end it soon, withdraw quietly, allow the sisters to return to their prescribed futures with nothing more than a memory they could bury beneath marriage and obligation. That plan required one thing he no longer fully possessed: time. Because secrets do not collapse when they are largest or most dramatic, they collapse when they are slightly misaligned. And as the Hartwell house moved closer to the night when all eyes would be present, when the architecture of control would be on full display, the smallest miscalculation, one step taken too quickly, one assumption held too long, was all it would take to bring 6 private truths into the same room, at the same moment, with no walls left strong enough to hold them apart. The night of the Hartwell debutante ball arrived wrapped in ceremony and inevitability, the kind of evening Savannah society believed confirmed its own permanence, and from the moment the first carriage wheels touched the gravel drive, the house ceased to belong to the family and became instead a stage upon which reputation would be publicly affirmed. Candlelight spilled from every window, music drifted into the humid air, and the magnolia trees, once accomplices to secrecy, were now lit from below, their branches transformed into decorative silhouettes, meant to suggest innocence rather than concealment. Inside, the sisters moved as they had been trained to move since childhood, their bodies performing grace automatically, while their thoughts strained against the weight of what they carried. Each of them understood, without ever articulating it, that this night marked an ending. Whatever existed between her and Elias would not survive the public futures being assembled around them. Suitors watched, mothers evaluated, fathers calculated. The sisters smiled and curtsied and danced, their private lives compressed into the narrow space between breaths. Elias, meanwhile, moved through the house as he always had, present but unseen, tasked with errands that kept him close enough to observe but far enough to remain unremarkable. He felt the tension immediately. It vibrated through the corridors, sharpened every sound, magnified every glance. This was not the house he knew. Too many eyes, too much order, too much certainty pretending nothing could go wrong. He told himself he would keep his distance, that he would not approach any of them tonight. But avoidance itself can become conspicuous, and Elias understood that sudden absence would invite its own scrutiny. The sisters felt his presence even when they could not see him, each interpreting that awareness as singular, as proof that despite the crowd, despite the ritual, something still connected them privately. That belief was strongest in the eldest sister, who had spent the evening accepting compliments with mechanical precision, while counting minutes between sightings of the magnolia shadows outside her balcony. She had convinced herself that one last meeting would bring closure, that they owed each other that much before the world closed around them. The second sister felt the same urgency but framed it differently, telling herself she needed reassurance, confirmation that what she would soon be expected to surrender had been real. The third sister sought neither closure nor reassurance but control. She wanted to dictate the ending, to choose when and how the secret would stop owning her. Each sister made the same decision independently, aware of the others doing the same. And so, one by one, they found reasons to leave the ballroom, to ascend the staircase that had always separated public virtue from private truth. The timing was not planned. That was the fatal flaw. Elias received the first signal as he passed beneath the windows, a soft knock, a flicker of candlelight, a movement that could not be mistaken. He hesitated, calculating risk, then moved toward the tree, telling himself this would be the last time, that he would correct this imbalance before it destroyed everything. He climbed quickly, silently, choosing the path he believed led to the eldest sister's room. He did not see the second light until it was too late. 2 doors opened. 2 voices spoke his name. The pause that followed was not dramatic. It was confused, suspended, almost polite. Each sister assumed at first that this was some misunderstanding, that Elias would step back, explain, realign reality to match expectation. He did not. He could not. The silence stretched, thickened, collapsed inward. Recognition arrived not as shock but as a slow, horrifying alignment of details, his absences, his inconsistencies, the careful way he had always avoided specificity. Accusations followed, sharp and disbelieving, not yet loud enough to alert the house but intense enough to pierce denial. Elias attempted to speak, to separate them, to restore fragmentation, but fragmentation was no longer possible. The third sister arrived first, drawn by raised voices, her confusion dissolving into comprehension the moment she saw him standing between them. The fourth followed, then the fifth, then the youngest, each entrance narrowing the room, compressing 6 separate realities into one unbearable truth. They did not scream at first, they argued. They demanded explanations from one another rather than from him. Each tried to reassert the narrative that had sustained her, only to watch it disintegrate as another sister supplied a detail she could not refute. Elias became irrelevant in that moment, reduced from participant to catalyst. The sisters confronted one another with a mixture of fury and disbelief that had no precedent in their carefully managed lives. This was not rivalry as society understood it. This was betrayal without an external enemy to blame. Voices rose, furniture shifted, a glass shattered, the sound carried. Downstairs laughter faltered, music stumbled. Someone paused mid-conversation. Then came the scream. Not planned, not restrained, the raw sound of something collapsing that had never been allowed to bend. The father arrived with guests close behind, drawn upward by alarm and curiosity in equal measure. He opened the door to a scene that no amount of preparation could interpret away. His daughters stood disheveled, faces flushed with emotion rather than exertion, speaking over one another in a cascade of accusation and confession. And there, unmistakably, was Elias. His presence in that room impossible to contextualize within the rules that had governed the household for decades. The truth emerged not as a single revelation, but as accumulation. Each daughter spoke, attempting to explain herself, inadvertently confirming the others. The father's authority, so absolute moments before, evaporated under the weight of simultaneous truths he could not discipline into silence. Guests filled the hallway, whispers spread. The spectacle could not be contained. What shattered that night was not simply the illusion of virtue, but the illusion of control itself. Every carefully arranged future collapsed in the span of minutes. The father did not rage. He did not strike. He went pale, then grey, then folded inward, his body betraying him as thoroughly as his household had. The ball ended not with music fading, but with chaos dispersing outward, guests leaving with stories already forming on their tongues, alliances dissolving before they could be sealed. And Elias, standing amid the wreckage of 6 intersecting secrets, understood with devastating clarity that the smallest miscalculation, the assumption that separation could be maintained indefinitely, had finally reached its inevitable conclusion, dragging every carefully hidden truth into the open at once, where none of them could survive unchanged. In the days that followed the collapse of the Hartwell ball, Savannah did what it always did when confronted with a truth too large to confront directly. It reorganized the story until responsibility, could be reassigned and discomfort neatly contained. By morning, the sisters were no longer 6 individuals bound by private choices, but a single cautionary tale whispered behind gloved hands, their names folded into one another until distinction no longer mattered. The house itself seemed to recoil, corridors emptied of music, rooms stripped of warmth, servants instructed to speak less, move quieter, observe nothing. The father did not rise from his bed for 2 days, and when he did, he moved through the house like a man walking through the ruins of something he had built but never understood. Physicians came and went, offering tonics and platitudes, but none could treat the injury that had truly occurred, because it was not physical strength he had lost, but certainty. He had believed himself architect of his daughter's futures, master of every variable, and now the variables had exposed themselves as people, unpredictable and irrevocable. The sisters were confined not as punishment, but as preservation. Each returned to her room under the guise of rest, as if sleep could reverse recognition. They did not speak to one another at first. Silence became both refuge and weapon. Each replayed the night relentlessly, searching for the precise moment where choice hardened into consequence, where retreat might still have been possible. The eldest sister experienced the silence as judgment, the walls themselves accusing her of failing to protect the younger ones. The second sister felt erased, her individuality flattened by scandal until she existed only as evidence. The third sister, who had once believed herself the most self-possessed, now discovered that control evaporates fastest when it is built on secrecy. The younger sisters oscillated between terror and anger, their understanding of the world having shifted abruptly from structured expectation to hostile unpredictability. And through it all, Elias was absent. His absence was not discussed, but it pressed into every conversation like a missing word everyone avoided saying aloud. He had been removed from the plantation before dawn, sent away not with spectacle, but with efficiency, his fate determined in private by men who framed necessity as order. No one told the sisters where he had gone. The lack of information was deliberate, designed to sever attachment by starving it of narrative. Yet absence, like presence, can deepen obsession. Each sister constructed her own version of what had happened to him, each story revealing more about her fears than about the truth. Savannah's social machinery activated quickly. Engagements were quietly postponed, then quietly dissolved. Invitations stopped arriving. The sisters' names appeared less frequently in conversation, then only in lowered tones, then not at all. Their beauty, once currency, became liability. Suitors who had praised refinement now cited delicacy and timing, euphemisms that allowed retreat without accusation. The father attempted to negotiate salvage, proposing distant matches, extended visits, strategic disappearances that might allow memory to dull, but reputation, once fractured, does not heal evenly. It splinters outward, catching others who fear proximity more than injustice. Within the household, discipline hardened into routine. The sisters were watched more closely than ever, their movements constrained under the pretense of care. Yet surveillance could not undo what had already taken root internally. They had seen the machinery of power stall and grind under the weight of truth, and that knowledge could not be unlearned. The eldest sister began writing at night, filling pages with observations she could not voice, documenting the ways the house reorganized itself around fear. The second sister turned inward, refusing mirrors, as if visibility itself had become dangerous. The third sister listened, to servants, to rumors, to the subtle shifts in language that signaled how quickly blame migrates to those least protected. The younger sisters clung to one another in shifting alliances, comforted by proximity yet wary of what closeness had already cost them. Outside the house, the city's narrative settled into something more palatable. Elias became a footnote, reduced to a transgression rather than a person, his intelligence and agency erased to simplify the moral equation. The sisters were recast not as participants, but as victims of temptation, a framing that preserved paternal authority while quietly punishing deviation. It was a story that allowed society to move forward without questioning the structure that had made the collapse inevitable. But within the Hartwell house, forward motion felt impossible. Time did not heal, it calcified. The father resumed his routines with grim determination, as if repetition could restore legitimacy, but his daughters watched him now with altered eyes, seeing not strength but fragility disguised as command. He spoke less, delegated more, avoided the rooms where laughter had once echoed. The sisters, in turn, learned the discipline of invisibility, how to exist without attracting notice, how to compress themselves to fit the reduced futures being offered. Yet beneath that compression, something volatile persisted. The secret had escaped containment, but its energy remained, shifting form rather than dissipating. It appeared in sudden flashes of defiance, a refusal to attend a gathering, a question asked too directly, a silence held too long. It appeared in dreams, where the magnolia branches no longer concealed but pointed, accusing and luminous. The house aged quickly under this strain, its beauty turning brittle, its elegance performing a nostalgia that no longer corresponded to lived reality. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of the plantation, Elias lived or suffered or ceased, without witness from those whose lives had intersected with his so catastrophically. The uncertainty of his fate became a quiet haunting, a reminder that the consequences of the night had not been evenly distributed, that power had reasserted itself by redirecting damage downward and outward. The sisters understood this instinctively, even if they lacked the language to articulate it fully. They had learned, at terrible cost, that secrets do not merely hide truth, they shape who is allowed to survive it. And as Savannah resumed its rhythms, convinced it had contained the rupture, the Hartwell sisters carried forward the knowledge that some collapses are not meant to be repaired, only endured, and that the most enduring damage is not what society condemns loudly, but what it chooses to quietly normalize and forget. As weeks bled into months, the Hartwell household settled into a version of stability that felt less like recovery and more like containment, a careful arrangement of habits designed to keep memory from erupting again, yet memory has a way of surviving precisely where it is most unwelcome. Savannah's summer pressed in thick and damp, the air heavy with the smell of river water and blooming jasmine, and within that oppressive heat, the sisters began to change in ways that were subtle enough to escape immediate notice, but profound enough to permanently alter the trajectory of their lives. The city had not forgiven them, but it had grown bored, which in Savannah society was often worse. Scandal required spectacle to remain alive, and once the Hartwell family withdrew from view, conversation shifted elsewhere, leaving behind a residue of judgment that no apology or explanation could dissolve. The sisters were permitted short carriage rides at dusk, carefully timed to avoid encounters, their presence framed as delicate convalescence rather than social exile. People they passed pretended not to recognize them, a cruelty disguised as courtesy. Inside the carriage, the sisters sat rigidly, aware that they were being seen without being acknowledged, transformed into objects of quiet speculation rather than participants in the world they once navigated with ease. Within the house, hierarchies subtly rearranged themselves. Servants who had once deferred instinctively now observed with curiosity sharpened by knowledge, their eyes lingering a fraction longer, their silence carrying weight. The sisters felt this shift acutely. They had crossed an invisible boundary, glimpsed a truth about power and vulnerability that could not be unseen, and it altered how they interpreted every interaction. The eldest sister's writing intensified, no longer simply recording observations but interrogating them, asking why love, when expressed across forbidden lines, became a crime only for some, while others retained the luxury of moral distance. The second sister developed a meticulous devotion to routine, measuring her days in tasks and prayers, as if structure itself could substitute for meaning. The third sister, whose curiosity had always been her defining trait, began listening more deliberately, piecing together fragments of information about Elias's fate from overheard conversations and passing remarks, constructing a shadow narrative that filled the silence left by official erasure. The younger sisters oscillated between moments of startling maturity and sudden regressions into childishness, their emotional landscapes reshaped by betrayal not just of society but of expectation. They had been taught that obedience ensured safety, that adherence to prescribed roles guaranteed protection, and now they understood that compliance offered no immunity when power felt threatened. Their father, for his part, retreated into management, throwing himself into ledgers and correspondence with a fervor that bordered on desperation. He spoke of the future as if it were still malleable, proposing travel north, extended stays with distant relatives, strategies that might allow the sisters to re-enter society under altered circumstances. But these plans were less about their desires than about restoring his own sense of control, and the sisters recognized this, even as they nodded and acquiesced. The house became a place of unspoken negotiations, each member maneuvering around the other's pain without directly acknowledging it. Nights were the hardest. In the quiet hours, when the city's noise receded and the house creaked with age, thoughts grew louder. The magnolia trees outside the windows, once symbols of romance and secrecy, now stood as reminders of how easily beauty could be weaponized, how intimacy could be reframed as transgression. Dreams carried echoes of that night, voices overlapping, doors opening at the wrong moment, the shock of recognition freezing movement. Yet even in these dreams, Elias remained elusive, his presence more symbolic than concrete, representing not just forbidden love, but the broader injustice that had shaped every outcome since. The sisters began to understand that what had happened was not merely a personal scandal, but a revelation of the system that governed their world, a system that depended on rigid boundaries to sustain its illusion of order. They had crossed one such boundary, and the response had been swift and unforgiving, not because of moral outrage, but because of the threat posed to established hierarchies. This realization fostered a quiet solidarity among them, a bond forged not by shared affection for Elias, but by shared disillusionment. Conversations that once centered on fashion and future marriages shifted toward questions of autonomy and consequence. Though always couched in language safe enough to avoid further scrutiny, they spoke obliquely, aware that walls had ears and that even trusted spaces could betray them. Savannah itself seemed complicit in this surveillance, its narrow streets and intimate social circles amplifying every deviation. Yet within this constrained environment, the sisters found small acts of resistance. The eldest sister shared her writings with the others, allowing them to see their experiences reflected and validated. The second sister began subtly altering household routines, granting servants small liberties that acknowledged their humanity without drawing attention. The third sister continued her quiet investigation, piecing together enough information to confirm what they all suspected: Elias had been sold south, to a plantation known for its brutality, his intelligence and charisma recast as liabilities requiring discipline. This knowledge landed heavily, confirming the asymmetry of consequence that had haunted them since his disappearance. It was one thing to lose social standing, it was another to lose freedom, safety, and potentially life itself. The sisters grappled with guilt, anger, and helplessness, emotions that churned beneath their composed exteriors. They questioned their own complicity, the ways in which their privilege had insulated them even as it confined them, the ways they had benefited from a system that now revealed its cruelty so starkly. These reflections did not lead to grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Such actions were neither safe nor feasible, but they altered the sisters' internal landscapes, reshaping their values and priorities. The future they had once envisioned, marriages that would cement alliances, lives defined by social roles, now felt hollow, inadequate to encompass what they had learned. Instead, they imagined quieter futures, ones that prioritized integrity over approval, though even these imaginings were tinged with uncertainty. Savannah offered limited options for women who had fallen from grace, and fewer still for those who carried inconvenient truths. Yet the sisters were not without agency. They began to plan collectively, discussing possibilities with a candor born of shared vulnerability. Education, travel, withdrawal from the most scrutinized circles, these became topics of serious consideration rather than idle speculation. Their father, sensing a shift he could not fully control, grew increasingly uneasy, yet he lacked the language to confront it directly. He had lost not only his social standing but his daughter's unquestioning trust, and that loss manifested in a strained politeness that replaced former authority. The house, once a symbol of prestige, now felt like a threshold, a place between what had been promised and what might yet be claimed. As summer waned and autumn approached, the sisters stood at the edge of an uncertain future, carrying with them the weight of a night that had shattered illusions, but also illuminated truths long obscured. They understood now that survival within their world required adaptation, not erasure, and that while society might forget the details of their scandal, the lessons it imparted would shape every choice they made thereafter. In this understanding lay both sorrow and strength, a recognition that even within constraints, consciousness could expand, and that the most profound transformations often occurred not in public triumphs, but in the quiet, persistent refusal to return to ignorance. By the time winter settled over Savannah, the transformation within the Hartwell sisters had progressed beyond private reflection and into something far more consequential, though still invisible to the world that believed it had already finished judging them. The city's social calendar resumed its rhythm of dinners, charity events, and whispered alliances, and while the Hartwell name was no longer spoken with open derision, it was mentioned cautiously, as if invoking it too loudly might summon discomfort. Invitations stopped arriving altogether, not with drama but with quiet finality, and in that absence the sisters discovered an unexpected freedom. Days once dictated by fittings, visits, and lessons in ornamental refinement were suddenly empty, and into that emptiness crept the possibility of self-definition. The eldest sister began corresponding with a distant cousin in Philadelphia under the pretense of exchanging pleasantries, but beneath the polite language flowed discussions of women's education, abolitionist lectures and salons where ideas mattered more than lineage. These letters became a lifeline, evidence that a wider world existed beyond Savannah's suffocating gaze. The second sister, whose devotion to routine had once been a coping mechanism, redirected her discipline toward mastery of estate management, studying ledgers not out of obligation but curiosity, questioning why wealth flowed so predictably upward while labor and suffering accumulated below. She noticed inefficiencies, injustices, patterns of exploitation so normalized they were invisible to those who benefited, and she began quietly adjusting what little she could, ensuring extra provisions during harsh weeks, advocating subtly for less brutal oversight, actions small enough to escape reprisal but meaningful enough to matter. The third sister's investigation into Elias's fate deepened, her network of informants expanding as she learned how to listen without being noticed, how to trade favors for information, how to navigate the informal channels through which truth traveled among those denied official voice. What she learned confirmed the worst suspicions. Elias had been sold under a falsified description, emphasizing defiance and moral corruption, a narrative designed to justify extreme punishment. The plantation he was sent to was notorious even among enslavers, its reputation whispered rather than recorded, a place where productivity was wrung from bodies until they broke. This knowledge did not paralyze her, it sharpened her resolve. She began documenting everything, names, dates, transactions, assembling a private archive that mirrored the ledgers her father kept, but told a radically different story, one centered on human cost rather than profit. The younger sisters, observing these shifts, absorbed them in their own ways. One found solace in music, transforming practice sessions into expressions of grief and defiance that resonated through the house, the melodies carrying emotions too dangerous to articulate aloud. The youngest, once shielded from harsh realities, grew perceptive beyond her years, asking questions that unsettled adults, questions about fairness, about who decided what was forbidden and why. The sisters' bonds strengthened, no longer defined by rivalry or comparison but by shared purpose, an unspoken agreement that whatever futures awaited them would be navigated together. Their father sensed this unity as a threat, though he could not articulate why. He attempted to reassert control through plans and admonitions, but his authority felt brittle, undermined by his own inability to undo what had happened. He was a man accustomed to command, yet he found himself confronted with daughters who listened politely and then quietly pursued their own paths. The household dynamic shifted from overt hierarchy to negotiated coexistence, tension simmering beneath courteous exchanges. Outside the house, Savannah continued its rituals, blissfully unaware of the slow revolution taking shape within one of its sidelined families. The sisters' exclusion became a kind of camouflage, granting them space to think and plan without constant surveillance. They began hosting small gatherings under the guise of innocuous visits from female acquaintances similarly marginalized by circumstance, widows, unmarried women, those deemed eccentric enough to escape scrutiny. In these gatherings, conversations unfolded. That would have been unthinkable in more respectable settings, discussions of autonomy, of moral responsibility, of the contradictions inherent in a society that preached virtue while institutionalizing cruelty. The sisters listened as much as they spoke, absorbing perspectives that challenged their upbringing and expanded their understanding of resistance. They learned that change did not always announce itself with banners and speeches. Sometimes it took root in quiet networks, in shared knowledge, in the refusal to forget. As months passed, the eldest sister's correspondence multiplied, her letters now carrying not just curiosity, but intent. She learned of women who taught, who wrote, who organized beyond the domestic sphere, and while she knew Savannah would never offer such opportunities, the idea that her life need not be confined to sanctioned roles took hold. The second sister's mastery of estate operations reached a point where even her father relied on her insights, a dependence that subtly shifted power. She used this leverage cautiously, advocating for changes framed as pragmatic rather than moral, understanding that survival often required translation into language the powerful respected. The third sister's archive grew thick, hidden carefully among mundane household records, a testament to lives otherwise erased. She understood the danger of what she was doing, the risk inherent in preserving truths that powerful people preferred buried, yet she felt compelled by a sense of obligation that transcended fear. The younger sisters, too, found their voices, one through art, the other through observation, each contributing to the collective consciousness forming within the family. News from the broader world seeped in despite Savannah's insularity, debates over slavery intensifying, whispers of conflict, the sense that the social order the sisters had known was neither as stable nor as eternal as it claimed. These developments lent urgency to their reflections. They understood that their personal scandal was a microcosm of a larger moral crisis, one that would not be resolved quietly. Yet they also recognized the limitations imposed upon them by gender, geography, and circumstance. Their resistance would be incremental, strategic, often invisible, but no less real for its subtlety. One evening, gathered in the parlor as rain pattered against the windows, the sisters confronted the question they had long avoided. What did they owe to Elias, to others like him, to the truths they now carried? The discussion was fraught, emotions rising and falling as they grappled with guilt, responsibility, and the fear of unintended consequences. They acknowledged their powerlessness in some respects, the impossibility of rescuing Elias or dismantling the system outright, but they also recognized their capacity to bear witness, to refuse complicity through silence. This acknowledgement marked a turning point. They resolved to act where they could, to prepare for futures that aligned more closely with their values, even if those futures demanded sacrifice. Plans were tentative, adaptable, shaped by caution as much as conviction, but they were plans nonetheless. As winter gave way to spring, the sisters stood on the threshold of change, not just as individuals but as a collective, bound by a shared awakening that could not be undone. They understood that society might never forgive them, might never reintegrate them into its carefully curated narratives, but they also understood that forgiveness from such a system was no longer their goal. What mattered was fidelity to the truths they had uncovered, the refusal to revert to comfortable ignorance. Their lives would unfold under constraint, marked by loss and limitation, yet imbued with a depth of purpose forged in the crucible of scandal and revelation. In choosing awareness over approval, solidarity over isolation, they stepped into a future uncertain but authentically their own, carrying forward the memory of a night that had shattered illusions and in doing so opened a path towards something far more enduring than reputation: integrity. By the time the second spring after the scandal unfurled its pale green banners across Savannah, the Hartwell sisters had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, not because the city had changed its mind about them, but because they no longer sought its permission to exist on their own terms. The magnolias bloomed again, indifferent to human judgment, and their fragrance drifted through open windows as if to remind the sisters that beauty could persist even when its meaning had been irrevocably altered. The city's memory, fickle and selective, had moved on to fresher dramas, yet the sisters' lives continued to unfold in the long shadow of what had been revealed. Their father, aging visibly under the weight of diminished influence, announced plans that would once have been unthinkable. Portions of the estate would be leased, some holdings liquidated, and extended travel arranged, ostensibly for health and family reasons. The sisters understood the subtext. Savannah had become a cul-de-sac, offering no forward motion, only endless circling around an old wound. Leaving, even temporarily, was not an escape so much as an acknowledgement that growth required distance. Preparations were conducted quietly, without fanfare, the household shrinking itself into manageable pieces. Servants watched with a mix of apprehension and cautious hope, aware that change, however uncertain, sometimes loosened old chains. The second sister oversaw the transition with competence that surprised even seasoned managers, ensuring that those left behind would not be abandoned to the worst excesses of oversight. She framed her decisions in the language of efficiency and prudence, yet beneath that veneer lay a commitment to minimize harm where she could, an ethic forged from painful clarity rather than inherited doctrine. The eldest sister finalized correspondence that had grown increasingly purposeful, securing invitations that were less social than intellectual, openings into circles where questions were welcomed rather than suppressed. She knew such spaces would not be free of contradiction or compromise, but they offered the possibility of voice, of contribution beyond ornamental existence. The third sister, her archive now carefully disguised among legitimate records, made the most difficult decision of all. She would not abandon her work. Instead, she arranged for its preservation beyond the family home, entrusting copies to contacts who understood the value of truth that might not be safe in the present, but could matter profoundly in the future. This act was not dramatic, no midnight exchanges or whispered oaths, just the steady transfer of pages and memory into hands prepared to guard them. The younger sisters absorbed these developments with a solemnity that belied their age, sensing that childhood had ended not with a single event, but through an accumulation of realizations that could not be set aside. On the eve of departure, the sisters gathered one last time beneath the magnolia that had once been a symbol of secrecy and longing. They spoke not of regret, but of resolve, acknowledging the complexity of their feelings toward Elias, affection entwined with sorrow, gratitude shadowed by guilt, and the impossibility of simple closure. They understood now that their love, however genuine, had unfolded within an unequal world that punished transgression unevenly, and that recognition would forever temper their memories. They did not pretend that their choices could redeem past harms, but they affirmed their intention to live in ways that did not compound them. As dawn approached, the city stirred, unaware of the quiet departure taking shape, and the sisters felt a mixture of grief and anticipation, mourning the lives they might have lived while stepping into those they would now have to build. Deliberately, travel altered them further, exposing them to landscapes and conversations that reframed their understanding of possibility. In cities where anonymity diluted scrutiny, they experimented cautiously with new identities, not false ones, but expanded versions of themselves that incorporated intellect, agency, and dissent. The eldest sister attended lectures where ideas were debated fiercely yet respectfully, discovering that disagreement need not equal disgrace. The second sister engaged with reform-minded thinkers who spoke of labor and justice in terms that resonated deeply with her observations, providing language for intuitions she had long harbored. The third sister continued her documentation, now informed by broader perspectives that connected individual stories to systemic patterns, strengthening her conviction that memory itself could be a form of resistance. The younger sisters pursued education with an intensity born of deprivation, eager to claim knowledge once withheld as unnecessary or dangerous. Their father, displaced from his accustomed dominance, struggled with irrelevance, yet even he seemed altered by proximity to his daughter's evolving strength, his authority softened by an unspoken acknowledgement that the old scripts no longer applied. Time did not erase the past, but it contextualized it, allowing the sisters to see their scandal not as an isolated catastrophe, but as an inflection point within a larger historical current, moving inexorably toward upheaval. News of national tensions reached them with increasing urgency, and while they could not predict outcomes, they sensed that the world which had condemned them was itself approaching a reckoning. This awareness lent gravity to their choices. They understood that safety and silence were not synonymous, that neutrality often served injustice more effectively than overt cruelty. Each sister in her own way committed to carrying forward the lessons learned at such cost, integrating them into lives that resisted simplification. Years later, when Savannah would whisper their names with a nostalgia stripped of understanding, the sisters would be elsewhere, their paths divergent, yet connected by an enduring bond forged in crisis. They would be remembered, if at all, as figures of rumor or cautionary tale, but the fuller truth of their transformation would reside in the quieter legacies they left behind. A student inspired, a record preserved, a small mercy extended when none was required. In this way, the night that had once seemed to destroy everything became the unlikely genesis of lives defined not by compliance, but by conscience. And now, as this story reaches its end, remember that history's darkest moments often hide the seeds of profound awakening. If this tale kept you listening, if it stirred questions or unease or recognition, subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you never miss another story pulled from the shadows, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this story affected you. Because the past is never truly silent. It waits for those willing to listen.